but just this week alone, our own government has said citizens should reset their phones once a week. And I think that is fascinating how far we've come to this point that is now the nature of the beast, because malicious code is running so far around everywhere. So restarting your OS, we don't have that habit when it comes to our mobile phones. So even restarting our laptops, a lot of us don't have that as a good habit. And as organizations, as CISOs, we should be forcing that function. And so I think it's been interesting to see more of this narrative come top of mind for folks that really never thought about security outside of why do I have to do 2FA all the time?
Welcome to Software Snack Bites. I'm your host, Joe McGosh of Bold Start Ventures, and today we're excited to have Ty Sbano on the pod. Ty is the CISO of Vercel and previously at Sisense, through the Periscope data acquisition, Lending Club, Target, Capital One, and JP Morgan Chase. I'm also joined by my frequent co-hosts for security episodes, Emilio Escobar, the CISO of Datadog. And this episode, we're going to cover securing AI workflows, security and code generation, and how to build effective trust and safety teams in a rapidly scaling organization. So I guess, let's just jump right in. For some listeners, they may not know what Vercel is, what it does. So maybe just talk about, kind of the short pitch for what Vercel is.
Yeah, it's really two simple things: developer workflow and managed infrastructure. So if you're a developer that ships software, not often do you want to care about how it's hosted and this idea of full stack ownership. Like, you just want to write code and you want it to be available and you want your app to be performant. You want everything to just work. But in reality, we end up spending so much time on infra and scaling and elasticity. And let me go talk to a technical account manager about getting reserved instances. And so we take that part and we abstract it out. And so developers can literally do this: develop, preview, and ship. Might be backwards depending on the screens, but you develop your software, you preview it in an environment that you can collaborate with business leaders as well as other engineers in a very fast way, and then you ship it. And then you're just moving at the iteration speed that companies deserve to do. And so our hook, Vercel enables the world to ship the best products.
Well, one of the things that we want to talk about in the area we want to move into is AI security. I think Emilio also will have several questions in this area for you. But one of the coolest things is v0.dev was launched by Vercel. It's taken the Twitter sphere and a lot of the tinkerers by storm. Frankly, I see it all the time, people using it to mock up user interfaces. Amazing product. But of course, this is a security podcast. So I guess you're putting something out like that into the world. I think you have some brand security problems, right? Where maybe you don't want people to create certain things that Vercel wouldn't want to be associated with, or whatever, right? And then you also have kind of internal security problems where if someone's trying to jerry rig the model to disclose sensitive info or something. So I guess where and what falls under the purview of security, and then how do you kind of approach security of some sort of really user-facing product like this?
Yeah, so there's a lot there to unpack. So feel free to pause and ask questions as we keep going. But at a high level, V0 was just incubated 8 months ago. It was an idea. It was a thought of generative AI that is going to actually generate UIs. So for a lot of engineers that are choosing Next.js or in the React ecosystem, or there's so many frameworks. For Vercel, our founder created Next.js, and that's something that we invest and support quite a bit. And then we make the premium experience through Vercel because we can obviously iterate very quickly with things like partial pre-rendering, initial static generation. There's so many things that we can actually do to make the world better in how you serve a very fast, personalized experience. And so with V0, the idea is this is the version 0. This is before you even get to 1. You want to have an idea of that wireframe. And we all used to do it on whiteboards. We also used to do it in graphical interfaces that we pay very expensive licensing fees to. And so for us, the idea was how do you do this as code? And so we have this amazing VP of AI, Jared Palmer, founder of Turbo Repo and a lot of other very cool projects. We actually started with a thing called the AI Playground. And so this is something before V0 where it was just, hey, let's get all the models, let's host them, And let's put them side by side, because a lot of people talk about comparing and contrasting. And so the experimentation before V0 was like, what can we do to better enable engineers to use AI? And so if you just go to like, what is it? Got it cached. There it is. sdk.vercel.ai. This thing's been out here for a while. We've been rocking and rolling with it. And you can just go in and, great if you want to authenticate and register, but you can do this unauthenticated. And these are just models that are out there that you can experiment with. There's not a lot of risk to us because we're not really storing a bunch of data and creating a massive model for anyone there. V0, on the other hand, does get into the aspect of training. And so one of the nuances for Vercel, I mentioned it, we work on a lot of open source. So it's not quite the same as someone's very sensitive code that they don't want it to enter a model. And unfortunately, we all read the news and have talked about it, but Samsung fell victim to that, and then it regurgitated out later. So tainting the model is very dangerous. And so we took a lot of lessons. We followed a lot of the context of what was being developed rapidly. But I think the good news is our team was already working towards enabling our employees with AI tools and capabilities. So we had a lot of lessons learned. We took those lessons. We thought about what is the code and the risk model actually going out. I type a prompt, I get a UI. It's not that big of a deal. I type a prompt that says, build me an interface like Datadog. Sure, it's inspired by it, but we're not generating you the Datadog image. We're not creating a carbon copy. And so we still have these conversations today. So what's different about generating it uniquely this way versus me going to datadog.com and getting everything and then hosting it? I dealt with this in banking and financial institutions where we would get clone sites all the time. And that's what they did. They would just pull down the code, make it look very similar, screw with the URL a little bit, and they would use it for like fraud and phishing campaigns and trying to get credentials. And so those are all very real. The challenge for us still remains the same on the back end. So trust and safety, like we can go deeper into that, but I don't want to extend too much of the narrative here without taking a pause and a breather.
I actually play with V0 quite a bit. I actually saw, I think it was Guillermo who tweeted, somebody built a Windows 95 theme ChatGPT prompt window. That was pretty cool. I think you pointed out some good points. I think there is an element of the realistic threats and risks that come with AI that I think we'll go deeper soon. But I think there's also a lack of understanding of some of these concepts that you brought up of, is the code that is generated by the model or inferred by a model, is it actually intellectual property of somebody else? Or how do you actually prove the lineage of, same thing with like a design, right? When you produce a web UI, how do you and say your legal team think about that internally? Because I know for us, it was a conversation of, if we're returning code, is this actually somebody else's code that was written that the model then just regurgitated, and we had to do some of that explanation? How do you think through that?
Yeah, so for us, what we're actually generating is React code, and then it's based on Shad CN UI. So Shad actually works at Vercel, which makes it very nice. And then we have Tailwind CSS on the back end. So, when we think about how we're approaching these things, well, the permissions and the grants and people opting in to support it, well, it's direct support. And so we get to iterate very fast with that in mind. I think the whole element that we look at is case law. So if you said generative images were IP, well, that's already been ruled not true, right? Like it's not novel, it's not unique. And so we're watching a lot of the trend lines.
If you don't mind, let's switching gears, but still staying within the same AI theme. Like one thing is having a project or a web product that produces design or mock-up UIs. And the other thing is actually now exposing AI directly to your customers through just an NPM package. How do you and your team threat model this? Because there's a lot of conversation out there about AI and risks, and we can keep going deeper, but the whole prompt injection and things like that, like how do you guys think through that?
Yeah, so threat modeling, I think, has come a long way in a very short period of time. And so as we took a lot of our inspiration with our internal workings of like, let's enable our employees with AI tooling before this big wave comes. And so we chose a couple of partners and vendors before I think a lot of security people were comfortable. And they're still writing policies of like, don't do this, don't do that. But there was no air quote paved path. There was no lighthouse that was shining the way for them to avoid the collisions. And so we went a little bit more aggressive. We took the step to say, cool, we're choosing you as a provider. We're going to use this to self-host, and you got to make sure that's true. You got to then give us the ability to use our own API key, and that's got to be true. I got the double bubble again. And it's a big part of making sure that we had the understanding, because it's not just contractual causes, right? It's got to be some of the technology aspects too. And so we take a hit on some of the hosting and some of the costs that go with it, but we control our model. We control where the data is actually flowing. So then we have less concern or risk of leaking. And I think that part of the inspiration for the threat model definitely goes into how we look at our generative products as well. What are the inputs? What are the trainings? What are the learnings? And so it's been fascinating, to be honest, because we're actually seeing a spike in requests when it comes to the right to be forgotten. So data subject access requests when it comes to prompts. Now, in the grand scheme of EU GDPR, I don't know if prompts are classically quoted as PIR sensitive data. And so we're honoring that bar, and it's a little bit of a burden, but it also impacts the user experience, because like you lose your history, you lose your training. So as part of your session, it kind of works against you. But if you don't want to use the product, we totally get it. But I think that element of like folks are still trying to figure this out themselves. So if I generated through prompts and someone eventually discovers that I used a product and I have those prompts, which is no different than searching stuff on the internet, is there a trace back to saying, where did you get your inspiration from? Or is this a novel concept? And so I think a lot of the policies are part of the pain and the challenge of the unknown. But everything from prompt injection to insecure object handling to sensitive disclosure, I don't actually feel like we're that far off from where we were with software security. And as someone that's been practicing for 20 years, the primitives are the same. We don't want remote code execution. We don't want information leaking. The difference is how you're interacting with the model. And so this old concept of you should never talk directly to the database, well, we all got a lot closer to this LLM. And so how you train it, is it a shared LLM? Is it individual? Is it private? I think there are a lot of things that go into the threat model, and each threat model that needs to be analyzed. So for our team, I've always indexed on this. I got a couple talks out in the world, but it's rapid threat modeling or hacker stories. I appreciate the concepts of doing a heavy threat model every time and starting from zero and then doing the mappings to, NIST CSF, or if we go deeper down into the MITRE ATT&CK framework, like we can do that every time. I just think it's a horrible use of time for teams that want to iterate very quickly. So as a new feature comes, I'd rather go down the hacker story path. What are the worst things that could happen? Okay, we're V0 Vision. We're adding the ability to now upload an image. Well, once again, the classic paradigm of file upload and the change of what you can upload is part of the conversation. Tell me any app that you've dealt with before, Emilio, that you didn't have that chat of like, what can we upload? Oh, is it CSVs? Cool, it's CSVs. Oh, is it executables? You said it was CSVs, but I could still upload an executable. So you have to test those parameters, and you also have to see, is it serialized or is it just sitting there natively and then running on the system? And I can tell you in banking, much different story when people are uploading PDFs and collateral. And again, if it's an executable and it's just running, then bad times happen. But for us, as we do those rapid threat modelings, we also have trusted partners. We also have a bug bounty. We have researchers. We have our internal team. And so the element that comes back to pay the most dividends is we have engineers that are there with us, not saying it's security's job to figure this stuff out. They are part of the conversation because they own the application. They own the experience. They see the vision and they see the future of where we're going. And so they bring some of those hacker stories to us. And then we're like, cool, we're going to go get some experts to test against what you're scared of. That makes sense to us.
Yeah. If you were to do a deep threat model and everything V1 comes out in 10 years, so none of us would actually be able to play with it at that point.
10 years, I don't know what the world's going to look like at this point based on the speed that we are iterating.
Yeah.
You mentioned self-hosting and kind of managing the training on your own. Like, I guess one aspect to that is like, as each new model, GPT-4 to GPT-5 to, whatever rolls out, right? Are you then saying, okay, well then like we're going to self-host that base model and then retrain kind of like, again, based on our data. So we know what we're kind of putting in and stuff, or like maybe talk through that a little bit just so I understand. Cause they're just, the versions of these models and the changes are going so fast, right? That even if you have something that works great on GPT-3 or 3.5, like a year later, maybe that's actually not state of the art anymore.
Year later, you waited too long and you didn't iterate enough. And so for the self-hosting, just to clarify, that is for a lot of our internal capabilities. For V0, it's dependent. It's all disclosed as part of our subprocessors and our AI policies. But when we choose providers as well, oftentimes it does make sense to have that experience directly there through the provider. And so what I find fascinating is we don't have to prompt the team to continually iterate and watch, the Anthropics, the Pinecones, the other things that are out there and let it be GPT-4. But it's also interesting to see the thought process of which one is better at the initial invocation or the initial generation versus which one iterates better. And so actually seeing the team kind of analyze between which model and how which one performs better, or which token is a limit that we're hitting and it's painful for the customer, or which one has more failure modes. These are all things that are lessons learned. And so for me as a security practitioner, I'm actually very grateful that I have folks that are pushing the paradigm so aggressively. And then I have a team. And so I have this wonderful head of privacy and compliance, Casey Taylor, and this amazing director of safety, and Dustin Kimmel. And we all pair. I also have a head of security, Aaron Brown. I got a head of IT and this man named Matt Straka. And we as a team make up security at our company. And so when we enter some of these paradigms, it touches all of our expertise. And so we can share in the learnings, we can share in the conversation, but it's about transparency as far as that threat modeling. And so I think with each iteration, I think what's been fascinating is cost efficacy. How much does it cost to run this model? And actually watching the team fine tune that narrative to say which one is better and which one is worse and which one's going to actually allow us to scale, because it's still a beta product.
Ty, I'll ask you first, but Emilio, I'd love to hear your thoughts too. But kind of just, has anything changed for you, Ty, in the sense of, kind of thinking about AI security now versus from before?
Well, let's clarify the line. When you say now versus before, what was the before for you?
Before, but yeah, okay, great question. Before, kind of ChatGPT or even the current renditions of LLMs, right? So you could still be using ML, you could still be using stuff like that. Has anything meaningfully changed with post ChatGPT, or is it kind of still the same building blocks, still the same stuff?
That's a fair question. Emilio, I'd like you to go first, because I think I've been doing a lot of talking. I would love to hear your perspective, because I'm going to run it back to my college times before I bring it back to the current time, and it'll be a little bit longer of a narrative.
And for those listeners, this is how a CISO delegates. Touche. No, that's fine. It's I actually believe, and Ty, you alluded to this earlier, I'm actually a firm believer that while there's some lessons learned, I think a lot of the primitives still apply, right? And I've been one of the ones that have been advocating. There's this huge fear around AI because we naturally don't understand it first, and security sort of reacts initially as a no because we don't understand it, and watch out for this and watch out for that. So I agree. There's a lot of fear and uncertainty and doubt going out there about AI and LLMs in particular. But how you manage your third-party risk, how you manage your data, how you manage your own software development lifecycle security and all of that, the primitives are still the same. Where AI comes to play, in my opinion, and I think we touch up on this a little bit, is there's a trust and safety aspect of it if you're actually doing some things more natively with AI. And I'm not talking you're building a chatbot that just responds some basic stuff, right? If you're, for example, you're Ty, for V0, taking on images and then using that to generate an image, for example. You brought up some examples of things that maybe Vercel most likely would not want to be doing. So what I think about AI, and I think the lessons learned for me is, there are two aspects, right? As a B2B, I have customers who may be in that position where they don't fully understand what are the risk ramifications of integrating with our AI products and what comes out of it, what happens to the data and things like that. So we have to be very transparent and clear. So I think transparency and clarity on that is paramount. The second aspect of it is internally, we should treat it as an enablement of the business. So, a lot of this fear, uncertainty, and doubt that came out when ChatGPT came out with will your prompts show up in somebody else's prompt response, the whole Samsung scenario and what have you. There are two aspects. These models are iterating and they're maturing. So it's becoming harder and harder for this to continue to be the case. But second, everyone in my organization wants access to tooling like this, and me saying no because there's this whole fear of our data showing up. wasn't the right answer, right? So as Olivia, our CEO, told me, we don't want to live in the medieval times, because living in the medieval times in AI means you didn't do something within a week or a month, right? Like it's moving that fast. So we just gave it to everyone. We found legal ways of doing it, and in a way that we protected our risk that we were actually concerned about, which is, okay, if it now becomes a core part of the business, what are the SLAs? What are the agreements, right? Because if they go down, we're impacted and things of that nature. So those are some of the lessons learned. Now, granted, we're still not at the place maybe where Vercel is, where we're hosting some of the models. So I haven't, but we thought about some prompt injection and things like that with our AI integration, and we've taken different paths to get there. But I still believe AI and prompt injection and all these attacks, like, while realistic, it's a lot easier to prompt inject a chat GPT that is general purpose and anyone is meant to be using than prompt inject an API that now you have more commercial companies using it. I'm curious if you agree with me or not, Ty, on that. So I think there's still an element of, there's some risk associated. There's a risk of whether you host your own M models, you run your own models, you train your own models, versus you just send an API call to one of these providers and get a response back. And I think people need to be realistic of where they are in that. But I'll stop. Long answer. Ty, now it's your turn.
Yeah, I like your answer. I think it makes sense. How real is it? It's super real. I think there are confines, there are boundaries, but if you're not taking the chance, like Emilio as a CISO, like myself as a CISO, saying, I can't be like everyone else because I don't want to be, saying no. I want to say yes so we can adapt now. Otherwise, like, there is no future. And so if you didn't have that existential crisis, it's not bad to have it now. Just don't panic. It's keep calm, carry on. And if you're a security professional, help secure the future. And we will get there together in a way that makes sense for all of us to be successful. And I think that transitive experience that we're going through now is like, a lot of people are panicked. And I would say rightfully so, but they do need to think about where are the limitations. And so going from software to in-person, we're seeing that change happen now, and with robots and automatons, and use another word of things that can actually move in our real space and not just software. I think life is going to be absolutely better.
Yeah. And then one thing I'll add is I know we have a lot of founders and would-be founders or people who want to be founders listen to this podcast. Is, while AI is a core component of the new technology that's out there, unless you're actually building one of these models and offering as a service, it's not your leading business. So focus on the problems and the use cases for your customers or your prospects, and then see how AI can then help you. I say that because I get a lot of pitches of like, oh, but we use AI. And I'm like, that's great, but it still doesn't solve the problem that you're saying you're doing, right? So, and I'm sure for Vercel and for us, it's the same, is how can it actually help our customers solve their problems? Not, oh, we just want to do AI, right? Like, there has to be a reason behind it.
I can promise you I get more of those pitches than either of you, but, but it's great advice. Like, focus on it. It still comes down to problems, right? We have to solve user problems in the best way possible, of which AI could be a form factor or a feature within. Right. But you know, there's too much. Oh my God! Like, AI in the SOC, like, I get pitched a new one every single day. You know, at this point, like, I'm not even sure what it means anymore. Like, just, you know, focus on actual user pain points and workflows, and then go find whatever solution you need to fix it from there. But
right. One thing that I find interesting about Vercel, and probably is not talked about a lot, right? Because I think a lot of the focus is in AI, is code security, right? So, I mean, there is SDLC security it's discussed a lot, right? There's the OWASP 10, there's everything. So there are two aspects of it, right? There is the code that your developers are producing, but also when you're hosting your customers' code, and even sometimes allowing some of that code to run in your environment. So we have a few questions there, and curious how you see it, and we can have a chat. But what advice do you have for other security teams that are actually storing customer code, right? Not running it yet, just to say, you're just storing my code. Like, what advice do you have for that?
I think it depends what code, period, right? Like, what code are you actually storing? If you're storing the flagship website, Yeah, it might be just UI, but if you're storing the flagship product, well, then I think it's a different discussion altogether. And then the sovereignty aspect becomes very important too. And so I think as we go down the sort of GDPR path or maybe sub-processor and vendor management path, knowing where the data is actually going is a very critical element, in my opinion. For those that are like choosing Vercel, it's a little bit different of a pitch and a narrative. And for me, it's like we're tapping into, whatever repo you choose. And if you authorize us to be there, we will scoop it up and build it for you and host it for you. And so I think that our model is a little bit different, but any team that just has source code, I think we've seen a lot of scenarios as of recent times that, backdoor access or non-human identities accessing code has become a real pain point. So I think a lot of those lessons when it came to like GitHub and their fine-grained access tokens, many of us kind of looked, learned, and hopefully evolved with it. But if we just relied on some of the general API keys or services that have been continually compromised, we should have probably moved on a little further ahead to increasing our visibility, but also our education of engineers too. Because it only takes one engineer that has the Chrome plugin or one engineer that has the new AI plugin with takes permissions and then grants it all the way down to the email and then maybe gets to your GitHub because you are an admin in that repo. So I really do look at identity access management as one of the critical foundational points of like, who is your admin for that repo? Who are they granting? And are you managing your supply chain effectively? And if you're with no idea and you have contractors all over the place and no one offboards people, then you're probably just in for a bad day, but you have no idea that it already happened.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I'll add there is there are different reasons for storing customer code, right? Like for example, if you're a Vercel and I'm building a web UI, web app, you need all my code.
That's correct.
But if you're going back a little bit to AI, if you're just providing me insights into my code, you probably only need to store some snippets of it, not the whole thing.
Yep.
And then the rest of the primitives that we already know apply, like permissioning, trust boundaries, and all those things. Now, when it comes to, okay, now, hey, Vercel, you have this worker thing or some of like a workload that you will run for me. Here's some random JavaScript code that you're going to run for me. How do you think about the security of that? And is it any different than just hosting my code?
It is a little bit different, right? Because we're doing it on your behalf in an environment, and these are our edge functions where customers do provide us with that code. I think the threat model is absolutely the same. We're being granted and gifted things to execute and run. And as you can imagine, on our enterprise tier, not a lot of abuse. On our pro tier, a little bit of abuse. On our free hobby tier, guess what, Emilio? All of our abuse. And so, I think we're constantly being tested by folks that, are creating at the moment of inspiration. And it's not just the dreamers that are trying to make the world better. It's also the bad folks that are trying to build out these horrible websites or the fraudulent websites. And we do enable it, but our tact is we have a trust and safety program that is constantly monitoring, looking for things like crypto miners, the stuff I mentioned earlier with some of the imagery that we'd never want to host because it just makes the world worse. And we want to stop it in its tracks as best we can. But we also have to rely on our cloud providers too, our service providers, in engaging with us on this experience. So if we have a downstream integration with a storage provider, we're also working with them in some of the conversation to make sure they have the legal language to support some of these, not just assessments, but sometimes these legal holds and these expectations of governments to make sure that we can retain that data. And so, when I think of these functions, it's just making sure that the isolation and the primitives around how we architect the execution effectively proper. On top of that, we want to make sure recursion and certain performance limits are there too, because it takes one function to go awry. And unfortunately, we do see that where if you don't know what your code is doing, we're going to do our best to know what your code is doing to prevent those moments. But there are times where if someone provides poor code, or maybe not of high quality code, and maybe there's not a protection there, and then a resource is requested over and over, guess what? We'll honor it. And I think that's one of the struggles of any service provider is that if it doesn't conform to the expectations of, say, your documentation or best practices, we end up with some of that shared responsibility that leans more towards the customer. And I think that's part of our tougher conversations, that we're still figuring out how to make that a better experience to have those alerts, to make sure you're informed, to make sure that if it is going bad, not just from a security element, but maybe a denial of wallet element that is actually taking a lot of priority with us as usage-based providers, right? And I suspect you in the Datadog world as a customer of yours, thank you. We also run into those things where maybe we're storing too much data or things that may never had to have been there in your services.
Yeah, we're okay with that, though. You can send us all you want.
I am well aware you're okay with that.
No, but all joking aside, I think these are valid points, right? And I think there's also an element, and I'm sure it's different for Vercel than saying a Datadog, because your Vercel functions sound more like general purpose functions that maybe what our workflow product will require you to have, right? So restricting which functions you can actually call within the primitive language that we support and sandboxing techniques and things like that. So
that's correct.
It is a very interesting game of isolation, as you mentioned. So that's fascinating to hear. I also think it's something that if as a would-be founder, as a founder, if you're thinking about building a product this way, or for any security team that's listening that works on a company that hosts and runs customer code, you should be thinking about isolation techniques from day one. I think this is clear. As a customer, I don't want my code to compete for resources than another customer that you have. But also as the provider, you don't want code to be competing against resources, but more importantly, you don't want somebody to just abuse your whole thing and make it a horrible experience for everyone else.
Yeah. But just a quick question, if on the isolation side is like, yes, okay, ideally that's great, but like cost for that should go just goes up, right?
No.
If you do it correctly with the right primitives of, again, you have isolation in mind from the beginning, it actually becomes more difficult to then say, okay, well, we have this massive enterprise account that has all of these subsidiaries and they want access to this code and that code, but not this code. And you're like, y'all, like that's going to be a tough discussion when it comes to role-based access controls and sort of the teams and organizations. But I think I really go back, because this isn't just my current role. This is my last couple of roles with data analytics as well. This is the same thing with banking, and you start allowing people to provide you with code or custom anything, and you're processing it on their behalf. And so if they're an administrator and they're granted this and they have the manual to do the things, like that's a big part of ensuring that the people that are with the permissions should be authorized and trusted. And so I honestly, I spent a lot of time on this scenario when big data started to become a thing. And I was in banking at the time. They're like, our data team needs access to this, this, and this. And the security team saying no. And I'm like, which security team? Why? And then I go run down and have those chats. And even though we have certain scenarios that are published where people are unethically abusing things and then maybe trading and making millions of dollars, and then the SEC intervenes, and you can look that one up from a different time I was at a bank. But like, there are scenarios that you're going, well, if the data team doesn't have the access to do their jobs and create their services and then do that isolation on behalf of their team, we're going to really struggle trying to do security with them, because we're going to say no all the time and try to narrow the path over and over and over, versus educating the right principles to say, let's right size, let's do just-in-time permissions, let's make sure to revoke access if that job's no longer needed. But that's a part of hygiene. And so again, I really do go back to that. It's not going to cost you more if you do it right from the beginning. It is going to cost you a lot more if you overly grant those permissions and you try to reel it back because of the pain of the change.
Yeah. And I think if I were to also apply maybe the concept of infrastructure or compute cost to your question, if you do isolation right from the beginning, then you have resource quotas that you apply and things of that nature that you monitor. And then those quotas actually help you stay in track to whether or not you're leaving money on the table for how much you're charging for these features. So it helps you also monetize from it as well.
Yeah, he's speaking from good experience, and Datadog's done a great job monetizing the experience. Congratulations.
You're welcome. So supply chain is interesting as a topic because there's a lot out there being discussed, but one similarity that Vercel and Datadog have, right, is you have your supply chain, but you're also a supply chain.
That's correct.
How do you think about this? How does Vercel think about this? And how do you make sure that I keep using threat modeling, right? But I don't mean like the deep threat models that you mentioned, but how do you think about these threats and risk and work with your teams on that?
Yeah. Again, nothing's new. This is all the same primitive here when it comes to bill of materials or supply chain or open source component management. And so for me, as I see a lot of startups emerging in the SBOM space, they're like, this is new, this is the thing. And I'm like, where were you when, all of us were doing this and writing into contracts and making sure this was part of the journey? And I think some of the legal side has had a good approach, but in the reality of things, it's been 4 key topics. 1, CVEs and vulnerabilities, knowing that when there's vulnerable code, what are we doing about it? Now, the challenge we never address, and I think it's really not great for us in the community, is that if it's medium and below, unlikely it's ever going to get fixed, and it's just going to sit out there forever. So if you've ever sold your product to someone that does an open source scan and they're like, Emilio, what are you doing about this? You're like, well, we're going to rely on the community. And so the next one I go into is the health of the community. There are a lot of open source communities that are very unhealthy. There are some that are getting taken over by bad people and sliding on in with their malicious code. And we've seen that narrative play out a couple of times, but that's always been my fear. And it's just becoming more real. And Log4j was a narrative that I've been talking about for 10 years, and it happened. And I go, wow, that is crazy, but not that crazy. It's just very, very practical. The third thing I think about is the transitive risk that we all struggle with. So those dependencies calling other dependencies, and a lot of the tools don't have the visibility to go down further. And a lot of the tools today are starting out as basics because they're adding AI, but they're still not looking at the taint risk, or they're not looking at the actual, is this function being invoked risk? And so the reachability, or whatever you want to call it, that is something I've found very important for some of the early tools in the space that have been acquired and taken off the market, that a lot of the newer players here need to really index on. And so for the last one, I think we glean over it way too much. It's the legal risk. And so all of the copyleft or certain licenses that are not as permissive, or, my favorite is the buy me a beer one, which is just like, that's pretty cool. It just makes it nice and easy. And then you have a connection to that community further. You meet this person, maybe they're running a company that is on a freemium sort of experience, or maybe they have an engineering job like a lot of us, that they're just doing work and trying to make the world better, and they solve the problem for themselves and they want to put it out there. And so I think that legal compliance actually hits a lot when we have the sales of software, when we engage with legal, when we go through due diligence, when we get funding rounds, when we get acquired, like all these moments, people want to see bill of materials. What I find as an abstract, a lot of lawyers see it at a high level. I don't think there's a full comprehension of that supply chain just yet. So I think education on this topic still needs to go a little bit further. And I don't think it's part of our continual narrative, but I suspect more and more we will have this readily available for our customers, not the internet, for our customers, so then they can see that we're managing our vulnerabilities and our backlogs effectively.
So good points there. And a couple of things I was thinking about adding is, I'm more, when it comes to supply chain, it's a community of volunteers working on things. I may have thought of an idea and I built a package, push it to NPM, and now it has 34 million downloads a week. Like, I never expected it to be like that, right? It was just, it solved my need, and I figure other people will have the same problem. And then we keep harping on these CVEs a lot, causing a lot of stress and pressure to these authors. I'm actually more worried about the provenance aspect of supply chain and the taint aspect that you mentioned.
Yep.
So one example, we'll probably see something soon, but open source authors of dependency authors having their own custom email domain, expiring domain. I take it over, I do a password reset, and these things happen. Like, we see this very common happen very often.
Yep.
As a supply chain of our customer, we also think about what build provenance do we build into our modules so that when they do install their packages, they know it's coming from us, right? And there's various frameworks there. The problem is that these frameworks are very difficult to implement. So you need a substantial amount of engineering hours to do so. I think this is Shomik, as an investor, I think this is an area where anyone who's actually simplifying this will be great. One example of it, and to give him a call out if we can, is 12 bits and their verify command for Homebrew. It's used by any developer out there, the Homebrew is, and there was zero provenance checks against it. On the open source side, you have Salsa, you have all these other frameworks that are out there, but it's very difficult to build it. So the more we talk about it, to your point, the better I think it's going to get. We see companies like GitHub, ourselves, Vercel, and everyone sort of discuss this, add things for it. But I think the provenance and taint aspect of it is something that is underappreciated, because people, we just focus on the CVEs aspect of it, and that to me is the lesser concern in my opinion. But it's good to know that you guys are also thinking about this just as well. So I think it will take a community to fix a community, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
So is the right way to approach it like if what I'm hearing is that, hey, the XZ utils and the log4js and whatever, they're going to happen. Like it is what it is. That's the nature of this world. They're going to happen. The only way we can kind of combat that effectively is basically by pushing the community forward more to be able to share these sort of things, share these insights, share what you do in that sort of scenario. Because otherwise, there's no way. Like we're all dependent on those dependencies, right? Like there's no way for us to avoid that. Is that kind of the right way to sort of summarize it?
It's the power of community.
That, and also make sure that you know what you're running in your environment, because when the XDUtil thing happens, you want to be able to respond to it quickly and not basically file a ticket to every single engineer in your company to fix something you don't understand. But yeah.
So asset inventory all day, right? Like you want to know what components you have, but you also want to see what do people have on their local environments. And if you have some sort of way of sharing components in your own environment of pre-prod versus prod, that's something you also want visibility into. And so I think a lot of it comes back to visibility, and there are certain companies that make life easier, but everything from your endpoint to maybe your even personal life, how you communicate and educate folks that aren't as tuned in as we are, because we're reading the blogs every night. We're looking at the news to see if some of that information is making it to the media. But just this week alone, our own government has said citizens should reset their phones once a week. And I think that is fascinating how far we've come to this point that is now the nature of the beast, because malicious code is running so far around everywhere. So restarting your OS, we don't have that habit when it comes to our mobile phones. So even restarting our laptops, a lot of us don't have that as a good habit. And as organizations, as CISOs, we should be forcing that function. And so I think it's been interesting to see more of this narrative come top of mind for folks that really never thought about security outside of why do I have to do 2FA all the time?
I had not heard that the restart the phones thing, but that's great to hear.
It's well intended but impractical advice. But yeah,
it's the NSA. Like take it with a grain of salt, but the zero-click exploits are legitimately out there, and each browser handles certain things a little bit differently, and your mail client might do something differently. But I am just kind of taken aback 2 days ago that this hit a lot of media outlets, and I'm curious to see how the uptake goes. Like, will people actually restart their phone once a week? Probably not.
Well, I want to wrap up with like kind of two final questions. So last one, and this is for both of you, but tied to, just to start off, is like kind of, does the concept of a SOC still make sense as we're having more of these AI workflows and as we're having more of these, code gen and a lot of automation and stuff like that, right? Like kind of a centralized sort of unit. Does that make sense? Like, what are your thoughts?
Yes, but, and I think yes, but because like with the power of AI and, choose whichever vendor you just spoke to that's going to solve it for you. I've probably spoken to a bunch of them too. I think the reality is a lot of organizations already have the data and the workflows. And if they have a manual security operations center, and maybe they don't have 20, 30, 40 people in that like security operations center with the screens, with the pew pew maps and all that going. But tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 support, I think, radically transform. And so when I look at EDR vendors, they've already taken a lot of those steps for us. And so getting high fidelity alerts so then we know when to action is going to be important. But what I'm pretty excited about is that step further is now going to be, maybe it's my daemon as my representative checking in with each individual every time that there's something funky, instead of like my team raising the Ty, did you see this thing? And I'm like, let me reach out and have a conversation. Did you just authenticate from this country? Because it seems inhuman that you would have went from here to here, and then we panic a little bit as we go through it, but some of us stay calm and it's okay. And then you verify. And so I think what we're going to see is a much faster turnaround, personalized experience that we don't have to have as many manual steps. So I think the Security Operations Center lives in the future, but it is, again, a much smaller team of high performant, high trust. And that way they can just execute with the trust of their model. And so they're monitoring their models as they execute, tuning them as they go, adding new alerts. And I don't think SOAR or ML did a great job here, but now with actual AI, I think this is part of that. It's real. It can happen.
Yeah, there's some elements to that I agree. I think so. We're a SOC-less company, and so the one theme that you will hear, I think, for this podcast episode is that this is not a new primitive. Security is not a new primitive in any way, shape, or form. Like, we're dealing with problems that other industries have dealt with for years, right? So I think the SOC is dealing with a big data problem or a lot of data problem, same as the insurance industry, same as anything that needs to do some analytical work. The challenge what I see with the SOC is that the approach that we've taken historically as solving it, to Ty's point, has been with more humans, right? And I don't think that is the solution to the problem. Do I think AI is going to replace every single person in the SOC at any tier? Maybe not, right? But for us, we actually see it as an engineering problem and a big data problem. So what we do is we build detections on the data streams, and then we alert on those, right? So I don't have necessarily a tier 1 to tier 4 type of person. Some of the signals that we respond to, the team that owns the piece of infrastructure that we're alerting from owns the triage in a response to that, right? So we talk about shift left security. Here we shift right, I guess, or shift to the right person. I don't know how to call it. But I think, to Ty's point, I think with LLMs and modern day AI, there is a play here. But I also agree with you, Shomik, like AI for SOC is there's so many versions of that I don't even know what it means. But what is clear is that this traditional model of having all your news media outlets on TVs and pew pew maps and like 40 people sitting behind a computer responding to every alert that comes in isn't the future of where the SOC is going.
Yeah. I think the word anomaly detection is being used quite a bit these days. I'm not opposed to it, but it's not new, y'all. It's been around for a while, and you just have to tune it correctly and make sure you don't burn people out as a result of it. And I think that's been the struggle of a lot of our technology that we've all rolled out. It's like, can we trust it? And it was like, nah, it's the same alert as before from our, anti-malware engine. And it's like, all right, well, we'll ignore that again. Let me fire the suppression, blah, 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 blah. And, I think that struggle will continue, but I feel very confident that the path we have forward is going to be with greater automation to enable, again, trusted partners within those security teams.
That makes sense. Well, Ty, thank you for all the insights and for sharing it with me and Emilio, and having a little back and forth.
Yeah, thank you, Ty. Thank you, Shomik. This is fun.
Yeah, thanks for creating the forum.